Hello everyone, this is Jed Schlackman. In today's video I'll be speaking about a topic related to eating disorders. The topic is what people have labeled as orthorexia. And the question here is, what is orthorexia? How is that defined? How is that reflecting a disturbance in someone's eating habits or psychology, their relationship with food, etc. So the word refers to having a preoccupation with, you could say, right eating or clean eating or pure food. So people that are given that label are ones who tend to be restrictive in what they're eating, with a mindset that they're avoiding foods that would be harmful to them or unhealthy. So it's people trying to be kind of extra conscious or hyper conscious of avoiding any food they feel could be harmful to their health. You could look at it as kind of like a fear or a phobia related to food, or an obsession or preoccupation with being completely pure in one's diet. So people that display this particular pattern might have a variety of different diets that they're choosing or applying in their life. And sometimes people will jump from one diet to another, but the general theme here is excessive restriction or limitation, in a sense, in terms of what a person is eating. Now, the challenge here is to distinguish when this is happening as kind of like a psychological disturbance or fear-based pattern versus a person who is using a particular diet or diet restriction for a medical health reason, for something that's going on physically, where that particular diet is having a positive effect. It's in some way helping improve their health challenge or health condition. So it's kind of tricky to discern there where one ends and the other begins, because sometimes a person does choose a particular form of diet for health benefits, where they're intentionally avoiding certain things because if they do consume those foods or food additives, it's going to have some negative reaction in their body, in their physical health condition. So we can look at our health and consider how the foods we eat or don't eat are affecting our health and paying attention to that, doing what we can to maintain a diet that we feel is beneficial to our health, that's not containing a lot of things that could be detrimental to our health. So that in itself is not negative or not a sign of a psychological problem, that people want to be conscious about consuming foods that are nutritious and healthy and not full of ingredients that are potentially harmful. But with anything, you can take something that's positive and carry it to some form of extreme, or develop some fears or obsessions about something, where even though it started out as something that was seemingly healthy and beneficial, it starts to turn into something that's ultimately creating more harm than benefit. So if your relationship with food involves a lot of fear, if you're overly anxious or preoccupied with avoiding a food that you think is going to cause physical harm or upset your health condition, then you're carrying this fear and anxiety around food and eating rather than bringing love and joy into the process of eating and nourishing yourself. And if that's occurring, then the anxiety, that sort of toxic emotion or feeling that you have, could actually be more detrimental to your health than any potential toxin or hazardous component of the food itself. So in that case, you could say that the benefit of focusing on healthy food is being outweighed by the harm of being fearful and anxious about your food or your nutritional ingestion there. So this is where we want to be more mindful and conscious of our own patterns, of not taking something to an extreme or becoming so anxious or obsessed about something that we're actually harming ourselves rather than helping or protecting ourselves. You can think of an analogy between this food issue of orthorexia and people who develop germophobia, people who become kind of obsessive compulsive about hygiene and cleanliness. So it's natural and sensible to be conscious of maintaining pretty good hygiene, of keeping your body clean, washing your hands, taking a shower. And that's something that people sometimes do take to the extreme, where they become anxious and fearful, where they're afraid that if they don't keep themselves totally clean, washing themselves all the time, that they're going to catch an illness, when in reality the threat or hazard of the organisms that they're afraid of is actually less of a threat to their health than the chronic anxiety or fearful thoughts about that. So the people that are constantly worried about catching germs, coming down with some infectious illness, they can actually create that in themselves through that anxiety, through those fears. And a person who's actually not so conscious about their hygiene but doesn't have fear about it, that person might be less likely to end up catching an illness because of the consciousness aspect there, the fearlessness, the not worrying about it, versus the person who's constantly worried about it. So we can look at this orthorexia issue that way, where yes, it's to some extent often valuable to be mindful of what we're eating, to avoid foods that are highly processed, to avoid foods that your body, for whatever reason, doesn't process well, that could upset your digestion or cause other issues. But if you get overly attached to that belief about things, to the fear that the foods you're eating are going to harm you, then it can kind of go into this downward spiral, this cycle of you becoming afraid of more and more foods, avoiding more and more foods, becoming more and more limited and restrictive in what you are consuming. And at some point, that's creating a lot more harm than having a little bit of so-called junk food. So our emotions have a big effect, a big impact on our health, and our relationship with food often is reflecting our relationship with ourself and with life. So if you're fearful, if you think you can't digest and process a variety of foods, then how are you processing your life experiences in general? How are you dealing with the world around you, with your relationships, with your job, all these other aspects of life? So this is where this orthorexia issue comes up. It's not just the fact that someone is restricting or limiting their food, it's the psychological and medical context that may go with that. You might have, at least temporarily, some medical condition or health issue where going on a specialized type of diet, at least for the short term, may be helping you with that. But you want to be cautious and not become too attached to that diet for the long term, to consider that you may end up restricting or limiting yourself beyond what's actually helpful. Let's say you're dealing with a flu, a cold, some acute infectious illness. In that time period, it may be very valuable to shift what you're eating to help your body get through that challenge, to help you come back into balance and equilibrium. But if you're continuing that shift in your eating beyond the time of that illness, then it actually might lead to some imbalance in your body. So there we can see that something could be beneficial, but if we overdo it or overuse it, it could lead to some negative outcome. So looking at our life and our relationship with food, we can consider what thought processes and what emotions are present. We can consider if we're becoming overly fearful of having negative reactions to food. The reality of food and things we're consuming is that just about anything can have some potential benefit and some potential hazard or risk, depending upon how we are ready to process and integrate it. So a food that might seem very nourishing and harmless to one person, another person might have some negative reaction to that food, and it's something about that person and how they respond to that food that's the issue. It's not necessarily inherent to the nature of that food itself. So there are both general and specific issues involved. In general, we might look at the processing of foods as being likely to create hazards. So if you're consuming foods that have like very concentrated amounts of salt, of sugar, of oils, beyond what's in the normal, natural way that food would have been used traditionally or how it comes in nature, then you're kind of increasing the likelihood that our body would have a difficult time processing that, and it could lead to some form of negative effect, some negative health issue. So in that sense, it seems logical to limit or restrict those types of foods. But if you're overly fearful that you might accidentally consume a food that has a lot of sugar or a lot of salt, then that anxiety, the stress you're creating mentally that impacts your body could actually exacerbate the likelihood of having those negative reactions. So we can do our best to maintain a healthy lifestyle, consume healthy, nourishing foods, but when we become kind of obsessed about it, overly fearful, overly rigid in a sense, where we're actually afraid of harm rather than trusting our body's ability to handle some degree of stress, then we're creating the likelihood of challenges for ourselves through our own consciousness. Eating disorders are relatively common, but not necessarily that commonly diagnosed, since people may not always notice or acknowledge they're having an issue with food. Some of the more common patterns of eating disorder include anorexia nervosa, which is a pattern of greatly restricting food consumption, and in that case it usually has more to do with body image, with a distorted view of one's body and one's weight, etc. So in that case, the person's not restricting food on the basis of healthy food and keeping your diet pure. It's more about they're trying to limit food to lose weight, to make themselves skinnier, even when they're already skinny. So that's the typical pattern for anorexia. And of course, there are other psychological, deeper issues usually present that have triggered that. So if you're working therapeutically, it wouldn't just be about trying to manage that eating behavior. It would be looking toward the deeper subconscious roots of it, any past traumas, family dynamics, etc. Another common eating disorder pattern is bulimia, and that's commonly looked upon or described as a person who's binging and purging. So the person might eat a whole bunch at once, they'll overeat, and then they vomit and purge it. So that's another form of distorted relating to food, which has deeper psychological sources. There's also just the plain binging, where people are eating a lot at one time, not necessarily every day, but it might be triggered on occasion by someone going through stress or emotional challenges, and their coping mechanism or their self-soothing mechanism is food, so they'll eat a whole bunch of food at once. So that could be labeled or identified as an eating disorder, particularly if it's having a significant impact on a person's health or their life and relationships. Our eating patterns can be challenged in various ways, and since as human beings we all consume food and we all have different emotional challenges in our life, we'll often find some form of imbalance present in our eating patterns that corresponds in some way with some imbalance within our being on an emotional and mental level. So it's valuable to see those connections and to consider where we're dealing with some type of psychological challenge, and not just to focus on the eating behavior. So it's not just about what you're eating, when you're eating, how much weight you're gaining or losing. It's also about dealing with our feelings about ourselves, our feelings about our life, about our relationships, and so on. So if you're dealing with any type of food challenge or eating challenge, you're not alone. It's actually very common to varying degrees. Most of the population at one time or another are finding themselves challenged with their eating patterns, with how they relate with food. And there are times where you're finding some value and benefit from being on a particular diet, but if you're finding that benefit and it's a kind of extreme form of diet where you're restricting a lot of different types of foods, be conscious of the possibility that in the long run that might not be the best for your health. There might be times where you need to shift, where your body might need foods that have other qualities or energies to them to help you come back into balance when you're in a different situation in your life, when there are different dynamics present, different stresses or different environments. So things are not really static. Foods and diets that might be helping you at one time might not be the best at another time. So be flexible, be open, consider what you're going through at different times in your life and what's going to foster or support more balance within your being, whether that's balance on a physiological level or balance on an emotional, mental, and spiritual level. This isn't really a very simple thing to address. There isn't just one formula out there that we can all stay focused on, that we can all follow to find our balance. We're all somewhat unique. So it's a process of self-exploration and being open to learning more, to shifting and transforming and finding more wholeness within our own being. I hope that this particular video has given you some things to ponder, some ideas and insights about your personal health, your personal growth. And if you're interested in these topics, you're invited to view other videos I've done. And if you're looking for additional resources for healing or healing services and events, you can view my website, phinsights.com. That's phinsights.com. For now, I'd like to wish everyone a wonderful day. Namaste.